You might have heard that sitting is the new smoking, but is this true? Today we're going to discuss the risk of too much sitting and some of the ways we can minimize that risk. So let's start by taking a moment, pause the video if you need to, and answering the following questions. I want you to write these down so they're available later on. During the last 7 days, how much time do you usually spend sitting on a weekday? During the last 7 days, how much time do you usually spend sitting on the weekend? So pause the video. Once you have your answers, click play and go ahead. Let's start by talking about the risk of sitting. Too much sitting is associated with a higher risk of high blood pressure, excessive body fat, and worse cholesterol. This can result in an increased risk in cardiovascular disease and cancer. As a result, it's associated with a higher risk of death. So that brings up the question, how much sitting is too much sitting? Unlike the physical activity guidelines, we don't have a set number. The recommendation is less is better. That isn't really satisfying, but there's a couple lessons we can learn from digging into the research around this area. Let's try to break this up into 3 groups. So I want you to take your number and pick which group you belong in. Let's start with group 1. You guys are sitting less than 4 hours per day. If this is you, you're doing quite well. You can still reduce your sitting time, but it might be better to focus on increasing your physical activity level. Your sitting time is posing a minimal risk to your health, so great. You can go get physically active instead. Let's now look at group 3, greater than 9 hours of sitting per day. If you're in this group, your sitting time is proposing a significant risk to your health. In fact, that risk might be as much as smoking. Men in this group would benefit from really focusing on reducing their sitting time. So that's you. This is a major area of focus. I don't want you to get discouraged though. There's a lot of things that I'm going to share with you that you can reduce that risk of sitting. Group 2. You guys are somewhere in between. So your sitting time may pose some risk, but it might not necessarily be your top priority. And if you can't necessarily change some of those behaviors, such as work restrictions, you may be able to reduce your risk using other methods. However, if you are able to reduce your sitting time, that can have huge benefits on your health. So what can we do to reduce the risk of sitting time? Well, the first thing we can do is we can just reduce how much we're sitting. And so when we're thinking about those strategies, we're thinking about activities that we do sitting that we can replace with standing time or light activity. Think about TV watching. Can you stand between commercial breaks? Can you stand and watch an episode? Anything you can do to really replace some of that sitting time with standing works. If you sit at work a lot, can you use a standing desk? All of those are options. You need to really consider where your sitting time comes from and what you can replace with standing or walking. Another thing we can do is breaking up your sitting time. So we're thinking about taking frequent breaks of either standing or walking to break up that sitting time. One of the main problems with sitting is it doesn't really let your blood flow correctly. And so taking a break every now and then, whether that be standing or walking around, can really help reduce that risk by helping your blood flow more correctly. Ideally, you don't want to be sitting for more than an hour straight, and so we're thinking about taking a standing or walking break every 30 to 60 minutes, depending on your circumstance. It's helpful to set reminders on your phone using alarms or computers, whatever helps prompt you to get up to take those breaks. If you're at home, you can think about standing up or moving around during commercial breaks of TV, or if you're on the computer, while your computer loads, you can kind of stand up, move around. And this is where you can do some of your tasks standing or moving instead of sitting would really help break up that time. So we're really just trying to avoid a long time sitting down. So if your butt's getting sore from sitting, that's actually not good. That means you've been sitting for much too long and you need to stand up. Another strategy is to be more physically active. And so if we're stuck sitting all day at a desk, we can be more active in the evening to offset some of those risks of sitting. Before we look at this more closely, I want you to go back to your logs and to think about this past week and write down the number of minutes of activity you got. So remember, you can double your vigorous minutes, but I want you to write that number down next to your sedentary number. Pause the video if you need to, and then we'll get back after you have that number. Let's dig into this a little bit more. In a large study of millions of people, the risk of sitting were found to be reduced if you were more active. What I want you to notice about this is that yes, you can offset the risk of sitting, but it takes more physical activity than the recommendations we talked about earlier. And so really, if we think about this, if you're struggling to hit those recommendations, we really want to make sure you're bringing down that sitting time. I'd recommend focusing on both physical activity and sitting time. That way you can really maximize that efficiency. So you don't have to be exercising an absurd amount during the week just to offset a high sitting amount. So if we can kind of work together and have those two things work together, we can maximize our benefits without having to overdo it on one end or another. Now, if you take a look at what you wrote down, where do you see yourself fitting in this graphic? Once you kind of pinpoint where you think you fall in this graphic, I want you to think about a couple different things. And there's a worksheet that helps walk you through this. What I first want you to do is to identify when you are sitting the most. What are some things you could do to replace that time? The third step to this is to try out those different strategies and see what works and what doesn't. Some things will not work and you'll want to do something else, and others will work really well. Just keep trying out until you can kind of get into that green zone where you're being active enough to offset your risk of your sitting. So remember, we need to get off our butts and on our feet. I'll see you next time.